Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple Podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible. Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Gerry Grandey. Gerry was previously the president and CEO of Cameco Corporation, one of the world's largest uranium producers. In 2011, he was nominated for the Oslo Business for Peace Award in recognition of his efforts to facilitate the dismantling of 20,000 Russian warheads, that's the megatons to megawatts program, with the resulting uranium used in nuclear energy plants for the generation of electricity. Mr. Grandey has a degree in geophysical engineering from the Colorado School of Mines and a Juris Doctor degree from Northwestern University. Gerry, welcome to Decouple.
Chris, glad to be here. Thank you.
So, Gerry, I do tend to ambush my guests with a little bit of a self-introduction. I like just to get my guests to kind of personalize and humanize themselves a bit to the audience. So I'll just pretend you're at a small dinner gathering and there's some interested young person that wants to know a bit about you. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
As I indicated, I have dual citizenship. I was born and raised California. As you indicated, I went to school in Colorado and Illinois, and really was focused early on in the practice of law. Then kind of gravitated into the managing of mining companies. And they were headquartered here in Colorado, probably in the late 80s, early 90s. Ended up selling them and taking a year off to do some serious skiing, and then got invited to move to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan to help Cameco sort of emerge from its government-owned past and become a global enterprise.
And that what years was that? Was that back?
I moved to Saskatoon in 1993.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, lots to catch up on there. I was actually had a conversation with Roy Romano recently, and he was telling me a little bit about some of the controversies. It might have been preceding that time, because I understand there was a referendum, I think, in Saskatchewan over whether to allow uranium mining to develop. That might even go back to sort of Tommy Douglas days, but
they nationalized the uranium mines. So you had provincially owned and federally owned uranium facilities in Canada. Everything was Crown Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately Cameco was created with the amalgamation of the government corporations.
Yeah.
And then ultimately it became private, i.e. held in the public market as a publicly traded company.
Gotcha.
One thing, Chris, when I was in law school, I actually was an anti-nuclear advocate.
Tell me more.
So I spent a good bit of my early legal days opposing the licensing of nuclear plants that were being situated and planned around the Great Lake Basin.
So did coal plants get built instead?
Of course.
Oh boy. Was that in Ohio, or I was reading a story about Ralph Nader coming up?
It was I worked for a public interest law firm.
Mm-hmm.
And it was headquartered in Chicago, which is where the law school was headquartered.
Yeah.
So my part-time job was working on the Calvert Cliffs decision, which was a couple of units in Maryland, and then looking at some of the units around Lake Michigan and Lake Ontario that were being planned or being built.
Right. Fascinating.
And I stopped doing that, moved to Colorado, went to work for a fairly large law firm.
Okay.
And ultimately gravitated into running a US-based uranium company. This is before Cameco.
Right. So what happened there? What was the turnaround for you?
Really a recognition, and you alluded to it, that every way you produce electricity has environmental impacts. And the company that I was running was both in the coal mining business, and we were entering the uranium mining business. And at the time, the government was passing surface coal mining legislation, clean air
Right.
legislation, clean water. So you began to look coal mining and uranium mining at the impacts
Hmm.
on the environment. And there's just, given the technical background, the physics background, there was just no way you couldn't see that the environmental impact from nuclear was far less than it was from other ways of delivering energy at the time.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is a topic that we've dived into a lot in the podcast, because I think amongst broad swath of the environmental movement, there's a lot of magical thinking about where energy comes from. Also, just in terms of the understanding of mining. And I have to say, I share that. I mean, or I shared that. I should say. I mean, the world's a lot simpler, and when things are kind of very much framed in black and white terms, and when you just, I guess, take for granted all of the materials in your life, right? I mean, someone just said this recently and it just kind of struck me. And I mean, I feel like an idiot, but it kind of struck me as something that was insightful. But I mean, literally, like everything that's not made out of biomass has been mined from the earth. And I think a big part of the eco-modernist argument around nuclear energy is that there's due to that incredible energy density of uranium, there's this fractional environmental impact related to the amount of materials that are required to build the plants and fuel them. And we're in the midst of talking about an energy transition away from fossil fuels. And what I've been thinking about recently is that we don't think about those big oil rigs out in the ocean or the Saudi wells as kind of being a form of mining, but I mean it kind of is, and it's this enormous energy infrastructure. And when you start looking at the sheer scale of it, it's just mind-boggling when you start contemplating getting to net zero or a full energy transition. I think Václav Smil has done some really good work just with the numeracy that he has explaining what a challenge that is. But we're talking about supplanting these gas and liquid fuels, and I guess coal as well, solid fuels, with minerals. And we're looking at, depending on which way we go in terms of an energy transition, if we sort of go the way things have been heading with I mean, some people call them renewables. I've been starting to call them rebuildables because, of course, the wind and sun represent natural energy flows, but the collectors not so much. But there's an enormous mineral impact to that. And I had Mark P. Mills on a couple episodes ago, and he was just, one of the facts he shared was that a 1,000-pound lithium-ion battery for a Tesla requires moving about 500,000 pounds of earth in terms of the overburden and whatever the ore grade is. So this fantasy world of things just appearing and having no environmental impact versus something like uranium mining is something that I'm very interested in entangling with and understanding better, because my only experience of mining, I think, is I'm in southern Ontario here along the Niagara Escarpment, and we have a lot of aggregate mines for it's limestone and for gravel, right? So I don't have a mine in my backyard really. And certainly I think the kind of community from which I emerged from, sort of environmental lefty community, has a bit of a Mordor vision of mining. And certainly, I guess, historically, mining has, and in certain parts of the world where it's not regulated, like in, say, Congo, for instance, where there's so much child labor in the extraction of cobalt, mining can be an incredibly messy thing. But unfortunately, fortunately, it's a necessary thing for the kind of lives that we want. So I don't know if I've just been on a monologue there, but go ahead and riff off of
Well,
that.
I'll just give you a little bit of commentary. I mean, if you look at almost every human endeavor, my dad grew up on a family farm in Ohio. If you look at the practices from 200 years ago, 100 years ago in agriculture, we would conclude, as we should, that there was a lot of environmental degradation. And mining is really no different. 100 years ago, 80 years ago, there were very little concerns about the way one went about mining, very few regulations. And then all of a sudden, society decided that, geez, environmental standards need to be imposed, clean water, clean air, surface mining activities. And mining, like many of the human endeavors, begins to step up its game. Unfortunately, we still live with some of the scars from 100, 200 years ago. And that's what frames, I think, most people's image of mining. Whereas if you go to sort of a modern day coal mine, which I ran, 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't even know the mine ever existed. Reclamation was done, elk live there, aspen grow, Water drainage is pristine. So, mining has come along like human endeavor generally, upped its game, built into the planning, ultimate restoration and reclamation.
So maybe that's a good jumping off point to talk about the history of uranium mining to a degree, because I think when most people think about it, particularly on the kind of activist anti-nuclear side, things like the damages endured by, say, the Navajo Nation are quite prominent. So can you take us back? I mean, I understand just in the research for this episode that uranium was only discovered in the late 1700s. We didn't really have a purpose for it. I think radium, like one of the decay products, became a hot item for medical uses
Yeah,
and
yeah,
making
hot
things glow in
items,
the
right?
dark. But yeah, like walk us through a little bit of the history of uranium
Well,
mining.
when uranium was first discovered, people didn't even realize what radioactivity was. And we have to remember that uranium itself as an element is not terribly radioactive. It's the radium that comes along with it, the radon gas. So just pure yellow cake or uranium is something you can hold in your hands, you can put in your pocket. You don't want to eat it because it's like lead, it's poisonous,
Mm-hmm.
but not because it's radioactive. So in the early days of uranium mining, whether that was by the government on the Navajo reservation or sort of in the western part of the United States or indeed in the Belgian Congo, people were after the uranium mostly because of its military application. By then we understood radiation, but what we didn't understand is when we were in an underground environment, that in addition to the ore you were mining, you were getting and releasing radon gas. And it was only 10, 15 years ago when lung cancers began to appear within the mining population did we make the correlation between underground concentrations of the gas, exposure to the miner without ventilation. Well, once that was realized in the 1960s, then regulations were passed, mining practices changed. And so today, when you go to a modern underground uranium mine like those in Canada or indeed elsewhere in the world, the ventilation reduces the radon levels to something well below safety standards, so that the underground mining environment today is as safe as staying in your house and being exposed to naturally occurring radon out of the soil or out of your basement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was looking at a Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission report, and they were looking at, because there's been longitudinal cohort studies of uranium miners throughout the years. And, I think they're always under pressure to, keep an eye on things and be a good regulator. So they did a feasibility study to look at, how to, or whether it was indeed possible to show an effect of uranium mining in the workforce. And from what I was reading, they're saying that the dose, the kind of extra dose that a uranium miner gets in a modern mine is something on the order of 1 millisievert per year, and average background dose is about 2.5. I mean, you're in Denver, Colorado. I think it's 10 millisieverts up there, right?
In Denver, it's about 10,
Yeah,
just
just
living
natural
in Denver, Colorado. There are
altitude,
many
and you got
places there are many places in the world where it's 30 and 40
yeah,
naturally.
yeah.
So the underground uranium mining environment today, much different than it was when we were ignorant about the impacts of radon gas. Today, it's a safe environment.
Mm-hmm.
The same, you can look at air quality, water quality, discharges, reclamation. I mean, all of these have changed from the practices that were followed in the 50s and 60s when the government was the one largely doing the mining for military purposes.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I guess there was the Atomic Energy Commission sort of artificially raised the price of uranium. They were trying to stockpile it for weapons at the time, and that set off, I guess, kind of like a gold rush, and kind of anything went, I guess, right?
It was a regulated commodity. It was a regulated price.
Yeah.
There was literally no market other than the U.S. government buying
Everything.
on behalf of the British and the French,
Okay.
and Canada contributing uranium production
Right.
under the buying program and
Right.
amassing huge inventories of uranium for military purposes.
And what about, like, because the other stuff I was looking at in terms of the impacts on the Navajo Nation were, these large tailing areas that haven't been cleaned up or haven't been done properly. What's the kind of evidence on health impacts from the mess
Yeah,
from that historic mining?
there again, I think the health impacts would be very difficult to quantify because the radon gas that's coming off the tailings piles is immediately being dispersed. And we know that the half-life of radon gas is very, very low. So to the extent that anybody built a dwelling on top of a tailings pile,
Yeah,
that would not be a good idea.
and that's the danger. I mean, the hypothetical danger of radon in basements, for instance, is that if the air is just sitting there, that that natural granite and thorium and uranium in that deposit can release radon, and that
Sure.
could accumulate. And so there's companies that will ventilate your basement, and I think there's a certain amount of controversy about how necessary that is and what kind of doses we can tolerate. But I think, again, it's kind of analogous to that magical thinking around how the built world arrives to us. I think there's this idea that the world, amongst many people, and I think myself included back in time before I got a bit of a science education, was that the world's kind of this pristine place with no radioactivity, and radioactivity is purely sort of an artificial phenomenon that comes out of human industry. And clearly that's not the case. And I mean, there's talk about some of the anti-nuclear circles, and I really had to do my research to kind of understand the concerns, ideas about hot particles, that a uranium atom could embed itself in lung tissue and give a strong local dose. But I was talking with my friend Geraldine Thomas, who's the director of the Chernobyl Tissue Bank, and she was saying, but there's elemental uranium blowing in the wind all the time that's concentrated in the soil. I mean, we're always being exposed to this, right? And so, in terms of that 1 millisievert of extra radiation that a uranium miner gets, it's very similar to other exposures that you get throughout your life in terms of, in terms of that natural background radiation. About 40% of it's radon, and uranium worker, about 40% of their extra dose is radon as well, I understand.
Uranium and radon are not the only radioactive elements.
Mm-hmm.
So you got potassium in bananas.
Yeah.
Bananas are radioactive.
Yeah.
You got Fiesta ware glazed with uranium.
Yeah.
But all of these were extraordinarily low doses, right?
Yeah.
Well below background levels. So you're absolutely right. It needs to be put into perspective. But the conclusion is we live with radiation every day.
Mm-hmm.
Significant other, he's going to be radioactive.
And in Denver, you're getting a higher dose than people if you're living in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and most of Fukushima district, I think, as well, right?
But absolutely correct.
Yeah. So you're talking. I'm just trying to get a visual picture in my head of what modern uranium mining looks like. I understand there's open pit mining. There's my grandfather was a hard rock mining engineer, and I'd probably put him to shame right now because I'm not describing it well, but underground mining. And then there's this in situ recovery, which I think is now the dominant way of extracting uranium. Can you just walk us through what I think most people can imagine an open pit, but this in situ process, I think, is probably not as well understood. I don't know if you can walk us through that a little bit more.
In situ uranium mining would be where you've discovered a heavier or higher concentration of uranium in generally a sandstone formation. And it may be 1,000 feet deep. And what it generally is an old groundwater channel in which uranium has been deposited over millions of years.
Mm-hmm.
And you can look at it and think about it as kind of a stream or a channel of uranium that's going to be, depending on how deep it is, 300 feet, 1,000 feet, maybe even deeper. And instead of putting a shaft down and trying to mine it conventionally underground, generally it's way too low grade to do that in terms of the concentration of uranium.
Mm-hmm.
So what you do is you develop oil field technology. You drill a hole with a conventional rig, conventional drill. You go into the formation. You find where the uranium is concentrated. And then you drill a series of other wells in a particular pattern, usually 5 wells to a pattern. So a square with a central drill or central well. And then you inject into these wells a solution that will dissolve the uranium in place. So in that sandstone environment where the uranium is concentrated, you put a solution in there that will dissolve the uranium, and then you pump it out and precipitate it in a industrial facility. And as you then leach that uranium in its particular location, you march down the channel, if you will, the ore body, and you just repeat the practice. And that's very common in the United States, and particularly Wyoming and Nebraska, and very common in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. So it is probably about 40 to 50% of the uranium produced today would be through the in situ method.
And that would have a much lower environmental impact in terms of not having tailing ponds and waste rock and things to deal with.
You're not going to have waste rock. You're not going to have tailings ponds. You're going to have a little bit of waste that ultimately needs to be disposed of. And it's likely to be slightly radioactive. So you typically would take it to a more conventional tailings facility from a previously operated underground or open pit uranium mine.
Okay.
The issue with in situ leach is you got to then clean up the groundwater.
Right.
Back to a certain regulatory standard. Depending on where it is, that can be industrial use, potable water use, agriculture use. So depending on where it is will dictate how many times you need to flush out the area that you've mined with clean water.
Gotcha. Okay.
In order to restore the environment. Because when you're leaching uranium, you're also leaching other metal elements. Maybe zinc, maybe iron. So you put those into solution, and they may be above a certain water quality standard, the concentration. So you just need to flush it out and restore it back to that kind of use that is dictated by the regulator.
What about, I mean, you mentioned, we talked about radon gas, but you were talking earlier about how the main sort of danger from the consumption of uranium, or if you were to do that, is because it resembles other heavy metals like lead, I think, and it's nephrotoxic. It's toxic to the kidneys. Is that a concern around mining sites in terms of tailings areas? Like, is that treated similarly to a lead mine or, other sort of heavy metal, heavy tailings?
It really is not an issue. I mean, to begin with, you're taking the uranium out of the ore.
Right.
The tailings are depleted in uranium.
Okay.
And they may have other constituents, other heavy metals like iron, nickel, arsenic. So you want to make sure that your waste, your tailings, are properly isolated from the environment. And there's not a potential of groundwater contamination. So these are very highly engineered, multiple barrier tailings ponds to prevent migration of any of those metals or contaminants into the environment.
Right.
Uranium is recovered.
Yeah.
In the form of what people refer to as yellow cake, right? And then you just want to make sure it's not dusty, because that would be a pathway for heavy metal poisoning. Right. So you just need to make sure that you got the industrial controls like you would in almost every factory, that you're not creating an airborne hazard when you're packaging the uranium product.
Right, right. And so in those mine shaft based mines, like the main tool to reduce the radon gas and the dust is just this very high air exchange ventilation. Like what is is just a massive HVAC system?
Yeah, it's a ventilation system. So you have big fans that are making sure that the air within the mining environment is recirculated
Okay.
and very frequently in the mine. So
Mm-hmm.
every 100 meters or so, there will be a red, yellow, green light system,
Okay.
and that will tell you about air quality. So if it's green, you're well below the standard.
Right.
If it's green, yellow, then maybe you're slightly elevated, but still safe. And then if it ever goes to red, which it shouldn't, but if it ever does, because you hit a pocket of radon gas somewhere, then you know I should withdraw from that area until the proper ventilation is established.
Right.
So it's a very sophisticated traffic light system of making sure that the underground environment is suitable for people to work in.
So, one thing I was talking about with Mark Mills was, it's very, very hard nowadays to get a permit, to get a mine permitted, particularly in the US. I think it's easier in Canada. Canada's um, it's certainly the head of operations, I think, of a lot of mining corporations, but a lot of that mining happens internationally where regulations are not as strong, obviously. And you can kind of think of it, I guess, as kind of an offshoring towards environments with less regulation. Is that something that's a big problem with mining and say like, and there's a lot of deposits in Africa, for instance, in those countries where there's less regulatory environments, is there kind of any international regulations or is it all sort of country based?
From a regulatory perspective, it's country based,
Mm-hmm.
but there are international organizations. The World Nuclear Association is one of them. The International Atomic Energy Agency is another, where there are guidelines established for how you would operate when you go into a non-Western regulated environment. To the extent that a Canadian or US or European company would be doing that, like Cameco went into Kazakhstan, we went into Australia, obviously the US, we would take best practices with us when we went, which meant if it's the best practices are dictated by the US, those would be the standards we would apply to building a mine in another jurisdiction. And I'd say virtually every Western mining company of any repute would do that. There's plenty of examples of mining companies from third world countries that don't adhere to those rules.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, here again, the absence of regulation gives mining generally a bad name.
Mm-hmm.
And you can point around the world at tailings dam collapses where standards haven't been followed or indeed standards weren't developed. When that happens, then everybody has the same reaction to mining generally that you and your friends would have, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a very natural impulse, the sort of not in my backyard impulse. Like I can think about the place that I grew up, beautiful river and forest there. And the idea of it turning into a mine would be really horrific for me. I'd be out there protesting. Like it's a very natural thing. I mean, you have to weigh that, of course, with, the fact that we need to mine in order to have not just the material comforts we have, but the very essential parts of a modern society. I mean, healthcare's got a gazillion mined objects, just as every other real economic activity within our society. But I mean, it's easy to see why people have a negative view of mining, again, while taking for granted everything that comes as a result of it. Okay, so another area that's come across my radar recently is this idea of seawater extraction of uranium. I understand that's a technology that's been under development for a few decades now, and I think it started off with titanium dioxide absorbers in the ocean, and there's been some big gains in efficiency. Still seems to be very uneconomic. Is this a technology that's going to be disruptive in the future? or what are your thoughts on that?
Is on your timeline, I think.
Yeah,
One of the more important things is all seawater contains uranium.
yeah.
So that's a naturally occurring element in seawater, but the concentration of uranium in seawater is extraordinarily low. So you're right, there's been about 2 decades or more of work trying to figure out how to efficiently extract the uranium from seawater. Technically, we can do it, but the amount of energy required to do it and then to recover it from the collecting agency is so far making it not economical.
Mm-hmm,
And I'd
mm-hmm.
be very surprised, given the low concentrations, whether it's ever going to be able to compete with a superabundance of uranium on the face of the earth. I mean, uranium is a very abundant element, and it comes in, ore bodies of varying concentrations. But we figure out as time goes on how to be much more efficient at recovering uranium from deposits on the earth and not worrying about the seawater recovery.
Yes, give me a sense of that, because I know historically there was a lot of interest. I think, initially at the time of the Manhattan Project, the idea was that uranium was an incredibly rare element. And then there was a big interest in breeder reactors because of the anticipation that we were going to run out of uranium or that prices would skyrocket, but there wasn't much around. Obviously, there's been a lot of prospecting and the amount of reserves keeps jumping. So yeah, give me a sense of how that's changed, that perspective on the relative abundance of uranium. And I know in Canada we boast some pretty incredible ore grades compared to elsewhere in the world. But give me your sense of where we're at with uranium reserves. I mean, one of the anti-nuclear talking points is that there's only sort of 80 years left of uranium if we were to run at sort of current levels. That's a very, very common objection that comes up. So shine some light on that.
And the comment is sort of like the prediction of peak oil.
Yeah.
And it really it's a function of, well, what's the cost of or the price of the commodity, i.e., what's the price of uranium per pound, and what encourages exploration. So when it looks like, okay, we're coming to some point of a peak in terms of uranium availability, price goes up, people go out looking for it. Lo and behold, after the last 4 decades of exploration and exploration cycles, we found far more uranium than we've ever utilized. And countries have got stockpiles as well.
Right.
So my own sense is it's really going to be not hundreds, but thousands of years before we tap the resources available in terms of uranium availability.
Right. Or until we need to go chasing it in the oceans or something. I know, like, people talk about, like, well, if we can get it from the oceans, then it will be renewable. And, renewable is obviously a big sort of marketing term and a big catchphrase. But as you were saying, the energy requirements to sort of get a small amount of ore out of a highly unconcentrated environment are pretty huge. So for now, we're going to be mining for quite some time.
Yeah, the other thing to remember, Chris, is that when we put uranium as a fuel into a reactor, we're using only about 10% of the energy content.
Right.
And we do know how to reprocess, we know how to recycle. It just happens to be more expensive than mining a fresh pound of uranium. But if in 2,000, 3,000 years we ever indeed run out of uranium, we'll come back to the used fuel and recover the other 90% of the energy content
Right.
for use in whatever generation of nuclear power plant we're engaged with at that point in time.
One of the other sources that we haven't talked about yet, other than your introduction, was the downblending of nuclear warheads. It seems like it's kind of the ultimate swords to plowshares maneuver there. But you were involved with the megatons to megawatts project. Could you fill us in a little bit on that, and I guess what amount of uranium is available from that source? How long did the program run for? What was your involvement?
It was about a 20-year program. And again, it started with not a treaty, but an agreement between the United States and Russia. And it, I think, was about 1992, 1993, in that period of time. And the whole idea was both countries had far too many weapons and stockpiles of uranium, far more than they'd ever need. And with the end of the Cold War, it was recognized, particularly on the part of Russia, that this might be a source of hard currency, which was desperately needed
Right.
back in the 1990s and the first part of this century. From a standpoint of my company, Cameco, we recognize it as a new source of uranium, almost like an above ground mine that properly tapped and properly introduced into the market could be made to look like a mine to Western utilities that would use the downblended uranium in their nuclear power plants. So we engaged the Canadian government, the US government. We were big enough and financially strong enough to engage in the negotiation and actually built on the agreements between the two countries. We invited a French competitor to come in and a German competitor to come in because the amount of uranium was quite large. And over a 20-year period of time, we brought back about 400 million pounds of uranium equivalent
Right.
into the market, which would be about 2.5 to 3 years of supply to the Western world. And obviously, it had to be done over a more lengthy period of time because the world was still producing uranium out of conventional mines.
Mm-hmm.
But it had to be done in a way that assured Russia it was going to get the amount of money it thought it was entitled to,
Right.
without destroying the market.
I was going to say, yeah.
It was going to pay for it.
Yeah.
That's where Cameco came in with our partners to make sure that it was introduced into the market in a way that the program negotiated by the governments actually worked and got paid for by utilities.
Because if you could introduce 3 years of supply onto the market, I mean, you could just completely crush uranium mining around the world, right?
And Russia had already done some of that.
Right.
By selling or dumping into the market in the late 1980s and early 1990s, civilian, quote unquote, uranium stockpiles, that drove the market from $30 a pound down to about 15.
Wow.
The prospect of the weapons material coming in was going to take it down to about $10 a pound, which was far below the production cost.
What's the production cost? I mean, I guess back then it would have
cost of virtually every mine in the world.
Yeah.
Okay?
That's wild. That's wild. So you guys managed to negotiate something whereby you could hit a middle road and allow enough of it in
we basically bought it from the Russians. We were participating in we didn't do the down blending, that was done in Russia, but the delivery into the US and then the selling it under contract to our US and foreign customers.
Right.
we took the financial risk by buying it from the Russians, hoping we could sell it at a profit to our utility customers.
Mm-hmm. In terms of like Canada's deposits, are we unique in having like the richest ore percentages in the world? I think on average it's kind of 1.5%, and our deposits are 20% or something like that.
General statement is correct, but the world average used to be, say 20 years ago, 0.15%.
Wow. Okay.
Think about that as like 3 pounds of uranium per ton of ore.
Okay.
I'm sure with the in-situ leaching now, it's less than that. It's probably more like 0.1.
Okay.
The early ore bodies in Canada were pretty spectacular, and these would be the ones discovered in the 70s and 80s. would have been 2% to 4%. But the current generation of mines in Saskatchewan, which is where they exist, the average grade is between 15 and 20%. So at 20%, it's 400 pounds of uranium per ton.
Wow.
Compared to the world average, which is going to be around 2 to 4.
And that percentage has a direct impact, obviously, on the environmental impact, because if the richer the ore, the less mining you need to do, the less you need to disturb the overburden.
Absolutely.
I guess, right?
So
Yeah.
the underground mines in uranium in Saskatchewan
Mm-hmm.
are from the air that look like a postage stamp.
Yeah.
And of course, because they're underground, there's very little surface disturbance. We have a workforce that is 7 days in and 7 days out. The beauty about that is they live in their northern First Nations communities. They provide role models to the community as mayors and civic leaders. They're working and drawing a superb wage. Miners are fairly well paid.
What are the average wages like?
That's all going to benefit back to First Nations communities in northern Saskatchewan.
What are those average wages like?
I've been retired for a while,
Right.
but it's generally in that 70 to 120,000
Okay.
range.
Yeah. For up north, that's not bad at all.
Depending on what you're doing.
Yeah.
And free meals, free room and board.
Oh, the mining camp life. I did a little bit of wasn't in mining camps, but I was in remote camps in the mountains in the Yukon, and that was
right. I used to love to go up there. The food's superb, and it's 7 days in, 7 days out. So people that can adjust to it actually really thrive on it.
So we just did an episode on nuclear as ESG, environmental, social governance, investment criteria. And I was wondering your thoughts on this in regards to uranium. I had Arthur Hyde on from Segra Capital, and he was talking, one of the features of uranium that, amongst many, that would make it qualify is that it's kind of single use is for clean energy, whereas you can't really say the same for a lot of other mineral deposits, which can be used for a whole variety of things other than just clean tech. So I guess a two-part question there. Certainly I want to know your thoughts on uranium as ESG, but also, in terms of, I was questioning him, and I was saying, well, uranium could be a dual use product. It has in the past, and weapons are a nasty thing. Where does the fissile materials for weapons come from now? Does any of that come from Canada or from Cameco? And maybe I'll just start with that as a question, then get into the ESG side of things.
The last pound of uranium bought for weapons purposes was bought by the government in 1968. So there hasn't been any private supply, if you will, back to the governments. Of course, Canada doesn't have a weapons program.
Mm-hmm.
The US does. If anything, it's selling some of its uranium stockpiles over the years back into the market, much like Russia did as part of the megawatts to megatons program.
Mm-hmm.
Megatons to megawatts, sorry. So literally it is, as you say, it's an ESG commodity. By its single application, its sole purpose is the generation of electricity via a nuclear power plant.
I'm trying to get a sense of, the chemical mines in Saskatchewan, for instance, right? They supply all of our CANDU reactors here in Canada, and then to what degree do they supply the US and Europe and other nuclear reactor fleets around the world? Do you have an idea of the kind of percentages there?
I think globally they would supply about 20 to 25%.
So just those mines in Saskatchewan?
Just the mines the mines in Saskatchewan and a couple of the other mines that Cameco would have in Kazakhstan and the US.
Okay.
If you look just at the Saskatchewan mines, understanding that COVID has kind of curtailed their activity, but when they're operating normally, they'd be producing about right around that 20% of the world supply.
On those what you call postage stamp size mines up there. That's
Exactly.
that's
Exactly.
wild. Yeah.
Very little impact. And again, any discharges are pristine. Air discharges are almost non-existent. Tailings are heavily regulated. I think the thing to remember is because of the background for the uranium industry, it is the most heavily regulated industry among industries generally. Things that would be comparable would be the aircraft industry, and the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
Uranium mining and energy production is heavily, heavily regulated. In most countries, there's a special regulator that looks after your mining operations.
Mm-hmm. So this, yeah, I mean, it seems analogous, obviously, to the nuclear generators themselves, and comparing a nuclear power plant to a coal plant, and the kind of restrictions are in place, the regulations, the PPE that workers wear, for instance, is miles apart when looking at even at the relative risks of working in each of those environments. So what you're saying is that's comparing, say, like the oil sands in Canada to the uranium mines in northern Saskatchewan. The regulations are so much stricter for the uranium mines. Like, how does it compare? Can you?
Yeah, in Canada, you've got a special regulator that looks only at uranium mining and energy generation.
Mm-hmm.
For oil sands, you've probably got a regulator that looks at coal mines and oil sands mines and other types of mining activities. And the degree of regulation, the degree of oversight is orders of magnitude greater in the uranium industry than it would be in the mining industry generally.
Mm-hmm.
I will say the mining industry, from a regulatory perspective, is approaching or moving toward what uranium mining has become over the years. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that mining is done in an unregulated fashion if it isn't uranium mining.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that we in the nuclear industry have been regulated stringently for 40, 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit more about Indigenous relations up in northern Saskatchewan. What was your approach up there at the time? I mean, as I was saying, I think anyone could think about a place that they like that they wouldn't really want a mine to be built in. There's trade-offs. We don't live in a magical world. We need to make difficult decisions at times. So what sort of agreements were made with the First Nations up there? In what sort of ways are things negotiated in terms of that land usage that you guys were involved with?
And you need to kind of look at it a little bit historically, because when the prospecting exploration first went on, it's Crown land, but it ultimately has sort of First Nations claims to it as traditional territory. So we early on went through lots of public reviews, lots of public hearings about the impact of these mines when built on the northern communities. And there's about 30 northern communities, Cree and Dene, that are up in the northern part of Saskatchewan. Some of them have got roads to them and some of them do not. So these communities are fairly isolated, and there isn't much of an economic base beyond tourism and a government presence, which is a little bit sporadic, right? So one of the things that was recognized is, okay, if you're given permission to develop a uranium mine, there must be benefits back to the communities. Employment, infrastructure, schooling, training. So these things in decades ago were thought about, talked about, and built into the licenses that the companies received when they were awarded the right to develop a uranium mine. Cameco and others that were active spent a lot of time making sure that the workforce itself was adequately represented. So well over half of the workforce when I was there, certainly today, well over half comes from the First Nations communities. And there's like a little commuter aircraft that just bounces around to the communities because the closest one would be 200 to 300 kilometers away from the mine.
Okay.
So that we don't let people drive, could be very difficult to do. So they fly in and they fly out, which of course is costly.
Yeah.
And hence the 7 days in, 7 days out rotation. As time has gone on, we've actually begun to formalize the benefit part of it back to the communities with what are called impact agreements or impact benefit agreements that recognize the obligation of the company to return benefits back to the communities in a formal agreement, in addition to employment, in addition to training, things that benefit, if you will, the community in terms of education, recreation, health, these kinds of things that make our own workforce better at what they do.
So what kind of I'm trying to get a sense of like a percentage or like, what percentage of the benefits does the community get back? I know that's probably a very hard question to answer, but in terms of profits or something, like, is there in some jurisdictions there's arrangements whereby there's sharing of I'm not sure if it's royalties or profits or just trying to get a sense that you've painted a picture of some programming and things like that, but in terms of what those communities see in terms of those economic benefits.
The largest would be simply the wages.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the level of wages that are being paid to miners at Cameco sites, and they're well paid.
Yeah.
So they're bringing a very, very good salary back to the communities.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, clinics, recreation facilities, education assistance, making sure that you get STEM education up in the communities so that the younger generation
Right.
is adept at math and science so that they can become part of the workforce if they choose to. So you have all of those. The other thing that was very important, I didn't mention, is we then created many, many First Nations owned businesses
Mm-hmm.
located in the communities, providing fuel, catering services, cleaning services, mine supply services, all kinds of contracting services, where again, the benefit goes back to the communities in the form of, again, wages for their employees and profits that those companies would make.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the other topics my audience would like to touch on is kind of the price volatility within uranium. Obviously, there was a big bull market in the early 2000s prior to Fukushima. There's a whole sort of Twitterverse that's dedicated to speculating on uranium. Where do you think things are going in terms of price? And it seems like if price goes really high, I mean, fuel is a pretty low part of the operating costs of nuclear power plants, but I've heard advocates say like, well, this speculation thing, it could get a little out of hand and could cause problems. I know that the financial sector seems to be waking up to it. Wall Street investors are starting to become interested. It's not Bitcoin or anything, but what's your take on where things are going at in terms of the uranium market?
Oftentimes I look at it in historical terms.
Mm-hmm.
You go all the way back to the time when the government was the only one to buy.
Yeah.
There was a regulated price. And then you had way too much uranium that was produced, a nascent nuclear power program back in the 70s, and the inventories of uranium overwhelmed the market and drove the price down. Well, then you had the inventories soaked up, and then the price began to come back. And then you had the Russians begin to dump,
Right.
and the price was driven back down. So it's a function of inventory and overhang. And when Fukushima happened, just before the Japanese event, the market was in balance, again, because of the efforts of Cameco on the megatons to megawatts. Fukushima happened, and all of a sudden, Japan shut down, and a few other countries began to shut down nuclear plants, which meant there was a lot of inventory once again available to the market. And it drove the price of uranium from a very high point, much too high probably, in the pre-Fukushima period, to where it is today at about $30 a pound. Well below the production cost of virtually every mine in the world.
Right.
It's now 10 years beyond Fukushima, and all of those excess inventories are just about gone. And it's been compounded, the drawdown of inventories has been compounded by COVID, because Cameco's had to shut down its mines, other mines have been curtailed or shut down,
Right.
putting further demands on inventory. Inventory is a psychological inflection point. As soon as you believe the price of uranium is going to go up, you hang on to your inventory because you believe you're going to get a higher price later.
Yeah.
So more recently, you've seen a number of uranium companies buying uranium in the market. Why would they do that? Because they can see the inventories are just about exhausted. They know there's going to be this inflection, which will be dramatic in my view, because it's always an overreaction.
Yeah.
There'll be an inflection point where the price of uranium begins to go up. People will get greedy. They're going to hang on to their inventory. Price will go higher to a point where finally people begin to sell. But by that point in time, inventories will be gone completely. And you'll now need to pay a price per pound, which generates that marginal pound to supply the reactor. And in my view, that's probably $60 a pound. So double today's price.
Things are going up. I mean, I think it's interesting to weigh that short-term view with, I guess, the future and the prospects for nuclear power globally, where, I was looking at a stat about the US. If the US doesn't build any more nuclear power plants, I think they'll be down to 6 reactors in 2050 as it currently stands. Obviously, China, I was interviewing Francois Morin of the World Nuclear Association, and he was talking about their very ambitious plans that they'll probably have more nuclear generation than the rest of the world combined by 2050. Russia's certainly building a number of reactors around the world and has kind of cornered the export market there. What are your thoughts about the prospects for nuclear energy globally, looking forward, on that horizon of something like 2050?
From my perspective, quite bright. You're right about China. Russia is also very aggressively building. Some of the Middle Eastern countries, Korea, they're aggressively building. A case in point is the United Kingdom. They've looked at how are they going to generate enough electricity? And they've decided, even though it's very costly to build a nuclear power plant, that it has to be a percentage of their electricity supply. So the United Kingdom is actually engaged in building reactors, as is Finland. Most of the other Western countries are going to be pouring their money into renewable energy.
Yeah.
Because politically, they can't talk about nuclear. Our election cycles are way too short.
Yeah.
Canada's becoming an exception. Canada recognizes that you need to have nuclear, as you do in Ontario, as part of the mix. But my own guess is that we will build a lot of wind turbines, a lot of solar panels, and we'll discover that we should have been dedicating all that land and its environmental impact to renewables when we should have been building small footprint nuclear power plants.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in for a bit of a rude awakening. I was talking with a UK expert, and he was saying, listen, of everything that's on the grid now, in the UK, there's only going to be, I think it was just Hinkley and Sizewell, if it gets built, that will be on the grid in 2050. And these renewables have a very short lifespan, and people don't realize that, the scale that's required is enormous, and then that fleet needs to be replaced every 20 years or so. So yeah, I mean, in my mind, I think a lot about the fracking boom and whether that sort of put off the nuclear renaissance with very low natural gas prices. I'm not sure if you share that perspective. I mean, there was a lot of
Oh, no, I do.
about,
I mean, a nuclear plant could not compete against a gas plant. There's just no way a nuclear plant with all of its capital cost ahead of time,
mm-hmm.
the length of time it took to build, could compete against a gas plant if you didn't put a price on carbon.
Right.
If you put a price on carbon, then nuclear would have been competitive. But we are unwilling to do that. We're much happier using the atmosphere as a toilet.
Yeah.
Right? Free. Just put all your pollutants, your methane, coal particles, CO2 up into this vast resource we breathe.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a wild part of it all. Yeah. Well, I think that's probably a good place to leave it, Gerry. But I think thanks a lot for making the time to come on today. It was great getting a chance to chat with you.
Likewise, Chris, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.